Yes, my name is Pamela. I was Director of Strategy at the Ministry of Justice, and I'm now working on something called the New Futures Network, which is trying to boost prison reform based at the think tank, the RSA. What I want to talk today about is some of the principles underpinning the prison reform agenda. Jane Austen, the great novelist and author of Pride and Prejudice, who gave us our title today, died 200 years ago in 1817. I want to talk about Sense and Sensibility, which is the title of another of her great novels. The case I want to make is that the criminal justice system has swung between sense and sensibility over the years, and actually where we blend the two and find a balance between the two is where real success lies. So next slide, please, Carl. Some of you might recognise the lady on the left there. That's Jane Austen, soon to be gracing a £10 note near you soon. I imagine fewer of you recognise the lady on the right. That's Jane Lee Perrott, Jane Austen's aunt, her mother's wealthy sister-in-law. On the 8th of August 1799, this Jane was accused of stealing lace worth £1 from a hat shop in Bath. £1 was 4 times the amount that was the 5 shillings, the amount that carried the death penalty. Jane's aunt said the lace was in her bag by mistake. The shopkeeper said it wasn't. She was arrested on the charge of grand theft, refused bail and committed to prison. Jane Lee Perrott was a rich, respectable woman. It's very unlikely, had she been found guilty, she would have been sentenced to death. But the alternatives weren't great either. She could have been brandied, she could have been deported to Australia for forced labour. Because of her social standing, while awaiting trial, she was allowed to stay in the house of the prison keeper at Ilchester Jail in Somerset, and her beloved husband James was allowed to stay with her. Despite these concessions to her status, she wrote that she suffered vulgarity, dirt and noise from morning till night. At her trial, the jury took 10 minutes to find her not guilty, based on her own testimony and the character references of her friends. I think we can all imagine what might have happened to somebody who was less refined than Jane Austen's aunt. In practice, criminal justice in 1799 had much more to do with sensibility than sense, and much more to do with the whims of individuals, the prejudices, the social norms of the day, community values, personal experience or the lack of it. That was rational at the time. Apart from the Bow Street runners in London, there was no organised police force. Capture and prosecution depended much more on vigilantes, the victims, local volunteer constables. Maintenance of law and order depended much more on deterrence than on apprehension. So the harshest of punishments went with the smallest of crimes. In 1799, 200 offences carried the death penalty. But in reality, local judges and juries had a huge amount of latitude. Juries could apparently downvalue the sum of stolen goods so that it went below that 5 shilling threshold that carried the death penalty. A judge might look at the person in front of them and say whether a barbaric punishment was suitable. Appeal was very common. So between 1717 and 1830, 35,000 death sentences were handed down, but only 7,000 executions were carried out. Sorry, only 7,000. So that's a victory for sensibility over sense, a victory for individual context and compassion, but not a victory for progressive values like equality before the law, not a victory for national consistency or evidence-based policy making or good use of data. This was sensibility over sense. So hold that thought for me. Historians in the room will know that that period, the late 1700s to early 1800s, was notable for a reason other than Jane Austen aunt's minor celebrity lace collar crime. In 1779, the Penitentiary Act was passed. That was written by the reformer John Howard, and introduced a policy of state prisons for the first time. 60 new prisons were built, including this one. And in that period, 1770 to 1800, the prison population doubled. Fewer people executed, fewer people sent to Australia, fewer people brandied, but more people sent to prison. So pop quiz, do we know another period when the prison population doubled? You can see from that graph that's the prison population over this century. We spike after the Second World War, and conjecture as to what the reason for that was, but the really big leap was from the mid-90s until now. The explanation for that is very complex. In a nutshell, better detection, longer sentences, longer time in prison. 1 in 3 sentenced crimes in prison today are accounted for by violence against a person, drugs and sex offences. These are all crimes over which the Crime Prosecution Service, the police, courts have very, very little latitude. So we can chart the criminal justice progression over the century as the application and triumph of sense over sensibility, of objectivity, of consistent national training and standards, of sentencing guidelines, of predictive analytics, of forensic science. This approach means that the outliers can be identified, the hanging judges versus the lenient ones, the racial and social groups for whom the system's manifestly unfair. They can be corrected and by national laws and policies, and which can be codified and rigidly applied. I think we can all agree that that's, we're pretty happy about that in principle. Postcode lotteries are pretty terrible in schools and hospitals, but very, very bad in criminal justice. The idea that you could commit a crime in Dorset and Yorkshire or not commit a crime and have a different outcome seems abhorrent to us. We're all quite happy for sense to triumph over the potential vagaries of an individual prison officer or the CPS. Or are we? Haven't we all felt the frustration of the inert, unthinking bureaucracy that stops something happening, not because it's the wrong thing to do, but because the system says no, and the system won't let them do otherwise? So let's go back to 1799. As I described the Jane Austen Ant's crime to you, we probably all had some of the same thoughts. Let's imagine the 2017 version of Jane Lee Perrot, who's quite well-to-do, maybe bored, depressed, maybe a kleptomaniac, maybe have some sort of substance abuse problem that was linked to her antisocial behaviour. Even if she was guilty, we'd probably all think that prison might not be the right place for her, not because she's posh, but because her spending some time in prison might not be the best way to keep society safe and fair and to make her pay for her crime. We know now about the success of restorative justice programmes or community sentences. Maybe she could be forced to work in that hat shop for a few months under close supervision. That has the value of being a visible punishment, but also helps her make a local contribution, restores social capital, excuse the jargon. Justice being done, being seen to be done and being done well. But too often at the moment, people leading these sort of initiatives, these sort of innovative local approaches, and are doing so in spite of the system, not because of it. How often have we all heard the term ask forgiveness, not permission, when you're trying to do something a bit different? I bet Phil might have used it in relation to today. We shouldn't have to do either. Our goal should be to blend sense and sensibility, to achieve a balance. We don't want to dilute or diminish the blindness of justice or the fairness of law, but we do want human beings to take context into account and be allowed to do so. And we do want the criminal justice process to work. We want it to be effective. We want people at all levels in the system to feel like reducing harm to society is their responsibility. The police officer to ask the right questions, the CPS to know what sort of sentences might be effective, and to pass that information on to the judges. We want these people to work with the information, data and evidence at their fingertips. So what factors define a system? What factors have to be present in a system defined by sense and sensibility? That's the next slide. Happily, we know a lot of what works in public service improvement from other sectors, from education, from health. And this isn't me making this up. I stand on the shoulder of giants like Michael Barber and Professor Julian McGrand, Andrea Schleicher. The 4 necessary factors, I'm sorry, you probably can't read all of those, I'll run through it. You can hopefully read the brain, the heart and the data, which is my very crude clip art formula. You need to devolve decision making as close to the frontline decision makers as possible. You need to empower the people closest to the decisions being made to choose how to lead their organisations. To allow that to be successful, you have to properly invest in them, and not just salary, although that helps, but at your recruitment, retention, training, invest in your workforce. To make sure those 2 things are effective at the same time as having some kind of national consistency and standards, you need to have absolute transparency to make people accountable. And that isn't about league tables and naming and shaming. It's to make a system that's intellectually curious enough to understand why things are happening, not just what's happening. And that allows you to set higher aspirations. Why shouldn't we set our standards against the performance of the best? The only one of those things that wasn't present in 1799, and actually it wasn't present until very recently, is that third one, really sophisticated, accessible, transparent data and information. the sort of system that allows us to be intellectually curious, as I described. Exhibit A, and I'm sorry, this is a horrible slide and I'm not going to talk through it. It's the Crown Court information tool. I share it with you here to ask you to go and explore it. It is an online database. It's available at justice.gov.uk. It holds comparative data for every single Crown Court in the country. You can tell why Derby has fewer fixed trials than Birmingham. You can tell why volume crime seems to be better dealt with in the North East than the North West. It's an amazing bit of kit, and I'm desperate for some data scientists to just delve into it and find something that public policymakers haven't found yet that understands why things are successful in one place than the other. Imagine if we had something like that for the prison system, prison and probation. Again, not to name and shame, but to just try and understand why things are happening, not what's happening. Finally then, let's have a look at this quite pleasing graph. That shows, again, you can't really read it properly, but that's the red line are female offenders in the system, and the blue line is the prison population that we saw earlier. So you can see that as a proportion, women in the system, the trend has been downwards. There are about 4,000 women incarcerated at the moment of a population of about 85,000. There are many, many reasons for this decrease, but my conjecture is that a large part of this story is that we better understand we better recognise that some of the crimes women commit are linked to abuse, addiction, and we treat those as well as the criminality. Because of the relatively small numbers involved, we have good data and professional networks. Police, courts and prison officers are trained to manage women in the system. There are very good examples of problem-solving courts disproportionately working well with women, family, drug and alcohol courts. The police and probation services train together, so they're able to learn from the best. We know the impact of mothers being separated from their children in terms of intergenerational crime, and we do something about it. It's very, very far from perfect, and I don't want to sound complacent. I'm trying not to catch CJ's eye because she'll be the first to accuse me of complacency. There's so much more to do. But I think the scenario we imagined for a modern-day Jane Lee Perrott was what might be getting a bit closer, thanks in no small part to people like Edwina Grosvenor and Sarah Payne, who's a prison service lead. We have a national framework for managing women in the system, but we also have a really empowered and intelligent, informed network of people working with them, sense plus sensibility. I'll give the last word to two heroes of mine. The first is Woodrow Wilson, American president. In that essay, which I recommend to all of you who are slightly nerdy followers of civil service reform like me, he captures the fundamental challenge of trying to make government better. But he appears to be setting up a sort of mutually exclusive choice for us between sense or sensibility. My version of that would be strive for public services that are just, moderate and simple, well-ordered and effective. Why should we choose? But let's give the last words to Jane herself, who gave us our title today. Systems and policies and public services are really just the combined acts of millions of individual people, and all of us are complicated bundles of sense and sensibility. It doesn't really matter why we do things, as long as we do the right things.